Hi, everybody. I'm Scott Immergut. I sort of help run things here at Ricochet. And I'm sitting in for Rob Long, who was otherwise engaged today and couldn't do this. He sends his regrets. We've had Charles C.W. Cooke, I call him Charlie because that's what I call him, on the podcast last week. And I have had Charlie on many of the shows that I have done over the years. For a long time, I've had him on. He's been my go-to guy on guns and gun law. And I also work with a bunch of sort of semi-famous law professors. Of course, if you ask them, they'll say they're very famous law professors. But I actually think Charlie, because he understands the guns as well as he understands the law, is almost is in some ways a more complete guest on this topic than the law professors who are always operating just from the legal angle. So, Charlie, welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start at the top here? And I know there's been some debate about this, and you wrote about this a little bit today, I think. Take us through the Second Amendment and tell me why the phrase "a well-regulated militia" being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, means everybody can buy a gun.
Well, there are a lot of reasons. First off, a well-regulated militia part is a prefatory clause. It really wasn't that unusual in the period to add a prefatory or explanatory clause into constitutional provisions. Eugene Volokh at UCLA has written a great deal about this, pointing to how common it was in the 18th century. The operative clause contains the phrase, the right of the people. There's nowhere else in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights where the right of the people is interpreted as anything other than the right of the people. The idea that it would mean the right of the government or the right of the state is silly. The founders were entirely capable of writing down government powers when they wanted to. And in fact, that's what the Constitution did. It was supposed to be a charter of enumerated powers that delineated what the federal government could and couldn't do. The reason the Bill of Rights is put in there in the first place is because the anti-federalists said, no, we want some explicit provisions that say what you can't do to us. And James Madison says, no, because then you'll undermine the whole point of the Constitution, which is to say only those things the federal government can do. Well, the price of ratification is the addition of a Bill of Rights, but the Bill of Rights, when it's introduced, is not particularly controversial. It's the ratification of rights that all American colonists agreed upon. This was one of them. It was debated as such at the time. Roger Sherman, who's a representative at the time of ratification, explains it. And he says this is an individual right, maybe one of the most important individual rights, because it's an individual's means of resisting tyranny. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Madison actually didn't know at the time how the amendment process would work on paper. And so instead of adding amendments afterwards, as we do now, and then assuming that they have corrected or altered the text, he thought that we would be inserting in the new provisions to the text where they were appropriate. So if, for example, they had decided that instead of being 30 to be a senator, you had to be 25, he thought they would scrub it out and write 25 instead of 30, instead of adding Amendment 1. Well, he proposes putting in the Second Amendment to the part of the Constitution that includes individual rights, habeas corpus, for example, not into the militia clause. So I think that's important. And then the last thing is, every single scholar at the time, every single textbook of the era and really of the 18th and 19th centuries describes this as an individual right. And so do all of the state level constitutional amendments. There are 45 of the 50 states. Sorry, Scott, California is one of the 5. But 45 of the 50 states have state level constitutional rights to keep and bear arms. And one of those is Alaska, which in 1959 copies the Second Amendment explicitly, verbatim, into its constitution, which of course would make no sense if it were a reference to the federal government.
Right. Okay, so that makes sense. So, and do I have this right that actually this clause came from British law 100 years prior to the Bill of Rights, or that it was inspired by that. Am I?
Well, the right is, I mean, the phrasing of the Second Amendment is odd. It's odd for a couple of reasons. First, it tries to compress two ideas into one. The idea that we shouldn't have standing armies, we should have militias from which the militias would be composed of people who are presumed to be armed. The second is that there is an individual right to keep and bear arms. So it's odd. It's also odd because the language changes. One of the most annoying constructions in constitutional law from the modern era is general welfare clause, because of course we have called government assistance welfare, and so when people hear it, they assume it's much broader than it is. The same is true of well-regulated. Well-regulated doesn't mean government regulation in the late 18th century. Mr. Darcy is described as having a well-regulated temper in Pride and Prejudice. That doesn't, of course, mean the British government were in charge of it. But to modern ears, it sounds discordant. So the exact phrasing of the amendment doesn't come from Britain, but the idea of a right to keep and bear arms does. And as is explained at the time by constitutional scholars and early law professors, the difference between the Second Amendment and the presumptions in American law is that it doesn't rely upon conditions. So in Britain, you can't enjoy the right to bear arms, and it explicitly said this in the law if you're Catholic. It says in the 1689 Bill of Rights, only Protestants have the right to keep and bear arms. Well, America's law doesn't do that. That's a very big difference between the two.
I don't think that would have worked. Again, folks, if you want to submit a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of Zoom. Here's an argument or a canard that we hear all the time now is, what would the founders, the founders never intended automatic weapons. They had no idea that, and they'd be appalled by them. Charlie, what do you think the founders would have made of AK-40 automatic weapons or semi-automatic weapons?
I think the first thing to say is that if you look at the way the Constitution is written, it protects categories, not items. So the First Amendment, it doesn't refer to newspapers or parchment. It refers to the press. It doesn't refer to letters. It refers to speech. Likewise, the Fourth Amendment refers to effects. It doesn't apply to, say, candles. And the inclusion of arms in the Second Amendment is deliberate. So you will get some people who say, aha, but at the time of the founding, all we had was muskets. Well, if the founders had wanted the Second Amendment to apply only to muskets, they would have written muskets. Instead, they wrote arms, and in Black's Law Dictionary from the era, arms are defined as daggers, as carbines. Well, the AR-15 is a carbine. As pistols, Glock 17 is a pistol. And although I think there is a reasonable debate as to whether these are included in the Second Amendment or just weren't regulated, the founders knew that people privately owned cannon and in fact warships, which are anticipated by the Mark and Reprisals clause within the Constitution. So, I think the idea that they were naive and antediluvian is wrong. Also, Thomas Jefferson was aware of Italian repeating rifles that could fire 20 rounds a minute. In fact, he gave one to Lewis and Clark before they went off on their expedition. They're aware of the puckle gun, which is an antecedent to the machine gun. The last thing I would say on this is, even if we assume that the founders would have changed their mind on this, and again, we ought to remember they were violent revolutionaries, but let's assume for the sake of argument that they would have changed their mind on this. The Constitution has an amendment process. And there is nothing in originalism that requires us to ignore the text of the Constitution, the original public meaning, because technology has proceeded. The First Amendment applies to Twitter, to email, to this event. If we as a people decide, no, we don't think this makes sense anymore, and I would profoundly oppose that change, then we can alter it. But until we do, the Supreme Court and all 50 states and the federal government are obliged to respect it.
That's right. It's just the frustration, obviously, is that it's politically impossible now, even though we've done it 40 times in the history of
Well,
the country.
Scott, I mean, why is it politically impossible? It's politically impossible because the vast majority of the American public likes the Second Amendment. And, I wrote against a Washington Post piece this week that pretended that the right to bear arms was invented in 2008. And the point I made was that would have been a great surprise to the 73% of the American public that 3 months before that decision came down told Gallup that the Second Amendment protected an individual right. Why can't they amend the Constitution? Because there are supermajorities against doing so.
That's
If
right.
there were
And
supermajorities in this country in favor of getting rid of the Second Amendment, we'd get rid of it. I can tell you this much. If the Second Amendment existed in England, there would be a 2/3 majority in Parliament and a 3/4 majority in the states, if not to get rid of it. But we like it.
Yeah, that's right. And you're referring to the Heller decision, which, again, correct me if I'm wrong here. I mean, part of the reason this comes up in the context of the Heller decision is that the Heller decision was the first time it was ever put in front of the court as to whether, yeah, that's right. So it was never asked before in 180 years, whatever, 109, no, it's more than that, 225 years, something like that.
Yeah, right,
So,
right.
Okay. All right, I'm going to ask a question from the audience here. This is from Leslie. My question is regarding support for firearm owners. In some states, such as mine, Massachusetts, defensive use of a firearm often goes hand in hand with investigation and litigation. What are your thoughts about organizations such as U.S. Law Shield, the NRA, Defense Fund, Legal Shield, etc., who advertise legal support for their subscribers?
I think it is a good thing. The Castle Doctrine came from Britain. It's now completely gone in Britain. There are parts of the United States in which it's been weakened too. I think that the Castle Doctrine at root respects the correct presumption in any case in which somebody intrudes into your home. And that presumption is that they, not you, have to prove to the law that something awry had happened. There is no reason that someone should be in your home. We have strong property rights in the United States, as we should. And if there is to be a presumption of guilt, it should fall on the person who is breaking in or has wandered in, rather than the person who owns the home. So insofar as the states will not fill that role, and most do, I should say, I mean, I live in Florida, it absolutely does. Insofar as states won't fill that role, then private institutions and insurance companies should do so. I don't think that in every case, Castle Doctrine inspired defense shootings are justified, but it should be really difficult for the government to prove that you and not the person breaking in did something wrong. And if it won't, then let's do it privately. All
right, good. This is a question from Charlotte. I like this question. Charlie, is there anything you personally would alter, amend, clarify about the Second Amendment? That is, if you were writing it today, what would it say / allow?
I think that I would split it into two. This would, of course, have necessitated a second amendment process because soon after the Constitutional Convention, the United States essentially adopted a standing navy and eventually a standing army. But I would have either made it clear that I'm imagining myself as one of the drafters here, did not want a standing army and intended to rely upon militias in one amendment, or I would have dropped it completely. And then in the second document, I would have just written what Pennsylvania wrote, which is the right of the people to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state shall not be infringed. Now, the state part often confuses people, especially people who are primed to argue that this is some sort of collective right. But you have to remember that at the time of the founding, there wasn't a great distinction between the citizen, the police, which didn't exist, and the army. John Stuart Mill makes this point that John Locke, not John Stuart Mill. John Locke makes this point that there's really no difference in the theory of, say, tyranny between you're being attacked by somebody who comes into your house in the middle of the night and you're being attacked by your own government. Now, if you take the police out of the equation, we didn't really have a police force till the 1830s in Chicago. If you take the police out of the equation, you can see how you had a hybrid assumption. So I think there's nothing wrong with mentioning militias and making it clear in that period that the people who are presumed to be armed might at some point be called upon to defend their state. But I would have separated out the provisions that pertained or were supposed to discourage a standing army because, well, almost 250 years later, you can see what's happened here. And funnily enough, it's not just people in 2022 who are a bit confused by the language. I mean, Thomas Cooley, who was the greatest lawyer of the late 19th century, and he wrote the great textbook, the one everyone had. He says, look, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, look, I'm a little bit worried here that this amendment's going to be misunderstood given changing language, and that people are going to assume that there is some sort of necessity to be in a militia. He says that's not what this is about. What this is about assuming everyone is armed and then afterwards asking them to help in certain circumstances. So I would have adopted Pennsylvania's amendment, which predated the Second Amendment by 15 years. The only thing is, you've got to remember that the Second Amendment was presumed to apply only to the federal government because until the Civil War and the 14th Amendment and incorporation, there was no application of federal law to the states. So I don't think the founders got this wrong, but knowing what I now know, that's how I'd change it.
Okay. We have a couple more questions here, but I wanted to ask you why I'm not a gun person, don't own one, don't really know much about them. So I get all of my information from the media, which is probably not a great source. So I'll ask you, why is the AK-47 such a popular weapon amongst people?
AR-15.
I'm sorry, what did I say? AR-15. So yeah, I didn't even get it right there. Why is it so popular? Why is it the gun of choice for these things?
Really reliable, light, easy to fire, low recoil. It is the most popular rifle in the United States. It's 15 to 20 million of them. It's undoubtedly covered under the in common use standard that Heller put forth in 2008. In a sense, it's not a gun. It's a platform. The analogy you might draw is with a Jeep. With a Jeep, it's modular. You buy the vehicle, and then you can change it however you want. Yeah, maybe it has a frame and the engine and the axles, but beyond that, you want to pop up the wheels and add your own, fine. You want to change the canopy, fine. You want to add a tow bar, fine. The AR is the same thing. Really, the part of the AR that is classed as a firearm by the federal government is this small piece of metal, the lower receiver, that doesn't look to the untrained eye like a firearm at all. That you have to go through a background check to buy. The rest of the gun, the bits that actually look like a gun, the stock, the upper receiver, the barrel shroud, the trigger, the magazine, you can order them through the mail. So really what you start with is a small piece of metal and everything bolts onto it. And that makes it different than, say, an AK-47, which, although there are some customizable AK-47s, is a pretty recognizable weapon, at least has been historically, comes in one shape. Or a Glock 17. Yeah, you can alter a Glock 17 or a Sig Sauer P229 if you really want, but you tend not to. You buy it intact and you use it intact. And AR is not like that. You can switch it out. And as a result, it's really customizable. It comes in all sorts of different calibers, and people like them. And I understand that in recent years, it has become something of a fetish weapon for people who want to do harm. It's still the case that most mass shootings are carried out with handguns, not rifles. But there are certain people who have been influenced by previous mass shooters and who've decided that is their weapon. But although it is a powerful weapon relative to, say, a .22 handgun, there is nothing particular about it that it would, if it were banned, change the American landscape on guns. It is an easily accessible weapon that is customizable, that is easy to fire, and that you can get everywhere. And that's why it's become the standard.
This is from David. What changes would you advocate to reduce the chances of attacks on soft targets such as schools, stores, etc.?
I think that this is a really difficult problem to fix. So I'm not going to pretend that I have answers. And I actually think that's a more scary thing to say and believe than that.
I heard
we could change it.
You were very articulate and emotional about this on the editor's podcast last week, and I recommend that to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to work out where this is coming next unless you have a police state. The number of children and staff who are killed in school shootings every year is about 7. Now, that's 7 too many. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that's acceptable. I'm not saying it's okay. I'm not saying it wouldn't shatter me if it were my own children. But 7 people out of 330 million, I can't remember all the numbers now, but I did the math last week. That gives you about a 1 in 1.3 million chance of it happening to you. Where do you start? Of course, that argument is one reason why I'm in favor of concealed carry, because I think where you don't have police officers, it is better to allow good people to be armed than to turn them into sitting ducks. And maybe that argument changes in South Korea, where there's almost no gun ownership. But in a country with 450 million, that makes sense. So what do I do? Well, the first thing is I really do think that we should harden schools. And I know that upsets people because they think it's a distraction. It's not. We already harden all sorts of institutions against attack. Courtrooms, movie theaters, Disney World, airports. I just can't believe the feigned ignorance from journalists on this question of a single door in and many doors out. That's how
I don't think it's a distraction. I just think it's an admission of defeat on some level.
Yeah, it is. It is. And, in the same way as we now lock the door to the cockpit, that's an admission of defeat. I think many of the things we did after 9/11 should be rescinded. I don't think they work. But that one, let's keep it.
Yeah.
Because maybe
the shoes thing needs to go. But
that needs to go. A lot of it needs to go. But that one's a good idea. And I think that where possible, you don't want to lock down your society, but where possible, let's harden our schools. And if we build new schools, let's certainly harden them. Let's certainly design them so that we can control them where necessary. That's the first thing. I don't believe in any federal laws beyond those we have. I think targeting types of weapon is a fool's game, as well as being unconstitutional. I am open to the idea that states should be able to set the age of majority. My view for years has been that every single question should be answered with 21. I would set voting at 21. I think it's ridiculous that we have this catastrophically chaotic age of majority where it's 21 for a handgun and 18 for rifle and 18 to vote, but 21 to drink and 21 to smoke now. And what if you're in the military? And if I had my way, I would harmonize it and set it at 21. I don't think there was anything that's wrong with that. And then I would make certain exemptions for people who are enlisted. We haven't done that. As a federalist, I am comfortable with states saying ours is 21 or ours is 18 or ours is 19, whatever they think is best. Florida says 21 for all guns. Texas says 18 for rifles, 21 for handguns. California says 21 for both. I think there is room for experimentation there. I don't think that's going to solve the issue, but I don't have a problem with trying it. And then I've been slightly misunderstood on this, so I'll try and be careful in how I put this. I have yet to find a red flag law that I like, and I'm strongly against federal red flag laws. But I am open to rules that respond to the pre-existing behavior of people who are making threats. Now, whether you want to call that a red flag law or a restraining order, or even at the bleeding edge prosecutions over speech, it doesn't particularly matter to me, or actually commitment into a mental facility. It is already illegal to say to someone, I'm going to rape you or kill you. It's not illegal to say you should be raped. It's gross, but it's not illegal. It is illegal to say, tomorrow I'm going to shoot up a school, tomorrow I'm going to murder you, tomorrow I'm going to rape you. What matters to me is that we have really strong due process protections on the back end. I am not against police being able to arrest people, for example. What I care about is what happens when they get to the police station. What evidence has to be provided? What's the time frame? I'm not against people being issued restraining orders. I care what happens next. I'm not against people being arrested for genuinely threatening speech, not political speech, but genuinely specific, imminent incitement or threatening speech. And I think the same is true here. If you say, tomorrow I'm going to go shoot up that school, I don't have a problem with you getting a knock on the door from the police. Mm-hmm. What I want to know, though, is on what grounds are they taking you in or investigating you? Who is overseeing it? And how long can they keep you or deprive you of your liberty? So I am open to ideas on that. And if we want to call that a red flag law, so be it. I haven't yet seen one that has enough protections for me because I'm a committed civil libertarian and I really worry about this stuff. But I sometimes think we get too hooked on the terminology. What is a red flag law? What is a restraining order? What is a speech restriction? Instead of acknowledging that we already have a system in America where the government can come and ask you questions. What really matters is what happens next.
Right. That sort of leads me into the next question that we've got here, but also based on something you and I were talking about earlier today. Charlie did the New York Times podcast, The Argument. I guess you did it last week, but it came out yesterday or day before yesterday, in which Charlie was paired with I can't remember the guy's name, but he's an op-ed writer at the New York Times, obviously on the left. And he was really the big takeaway for me was that he was incredibly honest, that he was fine with a trade-off of less due process, less freedom of speech, in exchange for tougher gun laws. So hold that thought for a second, because this is a question from Chris Hudson, who writes, why don't the Democrats get tired of banging their heads against the wall when constantly proposing things that either politically stand no chance of passing or have already been decided legally by the courts, including the Supreme Court? So this is all sort of a big question of like, this guy, again, made the case yesterday that he's fine with a little bit less due process and a little bit less freedom of speech. And yet they're still they're still pushing hard on this stuff. Why isn't it working?
Well, I think those two questions are related in that if you listen to that podcast, the big difference between us was that he doesn't really accept that the Second Amendment is a constitutional right. And I do. And so when I said, as I did, look, given that the Second Amendment is a constitutional right, it implies all sorts of other protections that we would apply to other constitutional rights. I think I don't think he said so. He was baffled by that. He was irritated by that.
Right.
And I'm not. I think once you accept, for example, that we have a right to a jury trial, then you accept that we can't limit it by viewpoint. So we can't say, well, Democrats get a right to a jury trial or Christians get a right to a jury trial. No one else does. And the same is true of the Second Amendment. Once you accept that it's a right, and you have to, because it is. I mean, we could change that if enough people agree. But once we accept that it's a right, then we can't say no Muslims. We can't say no women. We can't say no one who thinks that Joe Biden is a bad president can have a gun. Now, in other countries, you can. Maybe not the bad president example, but you have to prove in every other country that you are worthy of having a gun, because it's not a right, it's a privilege. And the point that I kept trying to make to him is, as long as this is a right, we're going to and should apply all of the rest of the Bill of Rights and all of the rest of the provisions in America's Constitution that are exceptional to it. But I think ultimately, because he doesn't see it as a right or value it, and he can't imagine valuing it, then he was pushing back against that. And I think that underpins a lot of the Democrats' behavior. They don't really think that it's a right. And in that regard, it mirrors conservatives' behavior on abortion. Now, conservatives are right about abortion because it really isn't a right. There is nothing in the Constitution that suggests that it's a right, and I hope that it's overturned. And frankly, I would hope that it was overturned even if I were pro-choice, because I think it matters that you have law that hews closely to the text. But because conservatives don't think abortion is a right, and because they don't value abortion, they constantly try to limit it. And the story of the last 50 years is of them trying to do that and being shot down by the courts repeatedly. Maybe that's about to change. I think that the Democratic Party, especially now, it was less so 10 years ago and less so 10 years before that, has a similar view toward gun control, which is, well, let's just keep pushing. Let's just keep pushing. And I think some of them believe that we actually all know how to fix this. It's just that some of us don't want to. This is something Joe Biden has said a great deal. And then what this guy intimated on the podcast as well. Yeah, well, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he did think that this was more obvious than I do. I mean, for example, at one point he said where there are more guns, there's more gun death. Now, that's just not true in the last 30 years. In the last 30 years, gun
and you made that point too.
Deaths and crimes committed with firearms have dropped in half, and the number of guns has increased about threefold, and the laws have been loosened. Sometimes the connection isn't quite that simple. So I think that's why they keep pushing. They honestly believe this connection. And then the last thing I would say, and this is an increasing problem for the gun control movement, is that the gun control movement, by and large, is full of people who don't know anything about guns and refuse to learn. And this is a huge problem for them. I mean, somebody on Twitter, I think the handle was Primal Polly, Jeff Miller, perhaps his name is, said, just imagine if we were having a national debate over cars and almost everyone who was anti-car couldn't drive. Now, that is how this goes. Yeah. That doesn't mean they're presumptively wrong, but it makes it very, very difficult for them to engage in conversation with the people they're trying to convince in any meaningful way. That divide is growing more acute, not less acute, given our political realignment. And Democrats as a party need to think long and hard about that, because it's in my view, hurting their chances, which of course I'm in favor of, because I don't want their solutions. And there's no better example of that than that they are utterly convinced, I think to their bones, that the only reason that the gun control agenda has failed so frequently over the last 20 or 30 years is because the National Rifle Association opposes it. And it's just not true. The National Rifle Association has done a lot of work in this area, of course, but the reason Republicans by and large oppose gun control is that Republican voters by and large oppose gun control, and Republican politicians channel that.
Yes, and they also
it's that simple.
They also make the point that there's, every Republican politician is in the pocket of the NRA, which the NRA is bankrupt right now. They haven't made a significant political donation in I think 4 years. There's other thing. I also think, by the way, there are two other things going on here. One, they do look at other countries like Australia, and now it looks like Canada is about to do the same thing, where they're, they at a signature, they're going to ban guns. Why can't we do that? Well, and you don't have to answer that. We know the reason why they can't do that. I also think and I see this especially here in California, and you and I talked about this the other day, the demographic that have increased gun ownership the most in this state over the last few years are African Americans and women. And that's a very inconvenient thing for the Democratic Party to deal with. They can't really.
And look, Democrats aren't entirely wrong when they look at other countries and say, why does this happen less? Why aren't there many mass shootings in South Korea? Because there aren't many guns. Now, you have to be very careful to start wanting that, because although it is true that there aren't very many guns in South Korea, their suicide rate is, I think I last checked, twice ours. So although they don't use guns in suicides in South Korea, and guns in America are by far and away the largest cause of death by firearm, suicides, I should say, by the way. It's not murder, it's suicides. That is our biggest problem. We don't talk about it very much, but it's our biggest problem. South Korea has twice, I think, the number of, or close to it, twice the number of suicides. But it is true that there are fewer mass shootings in South Korea because there are fewer guns. The thing is, I just don't think that's a very interesting statistic. I mean, it's like saying there are fewer mountain climbing accidents in Florida. Yeah, because Florida's flat. But there are 450 million guns in America. And there is a strong history of gun control. And there is a constitutional amendment that protects it that is widely enjoyed. And as such, you have to write laws in a completely different way than you would in South Korea, where you can pretty much assume that no one is armed. And, you know, so if the follow-up to that is, well, surely it will be good to start somewhere and try and get to where South Korea is. I don't think so. I mean, the prohibition of alcohol failed. God knows what it would be like if you tried it with guns. With 450 million of them, with 110 million gun owners at least, with, you know, our political divisions. So I just, you know, I don't think, well, look what happens elsewhere is a particularly interesting or useful thing to say.
All right. This is a question from Stephen. What do you say in response to those on the left who dismiss the argument that you have a right to protect yourself against a tyrannical government by the Second Amendment, by responding that the might of the federal government makes this argument moot? Well, this is the cannons argument, you know, or the F-14 argument, whatever you want to say. So do your thing.
Well, I mean, firstly, I think if I'm likely to be killed by my own government, I'll hang on to my guns. But I mean, I just don't think that it's borne out by recent history. The United States military is extremely powerful, but it couldn't prevail, at least not over any period of time, over peasants with AK-47s in Afghanistan. It couldn't hold Iraq. It couldn't hold Vietnam. The power of a well-armed citizenry has been confirmed. Just men with small arms. And in order to believe it would be different here, you have to believe two things that I think are unlikely. One is that there would be more support for brutal treatment of American citizens than for brutal treatment of Afghani rebels. I don't think that. And I would look back to the American Revolutionary War, in which 1/3 of the British Parliament was on the side of the colonists, and that number increased as the war continued because they were embarrassed by the fighting with people they considered to be their brothers. And the second thing I would say is that if you look at the demographic makeup of America's police officers, firefighters, and armed forces, the idea that those people are going to agree to ruthlessly put down their neighbors seems to me utterly far-fetched. Now, so is the idea at the moment of us having to fight a war against our own government. But you know, if we're going to play the numbers game, and this isn't entirely a numbers game and it shouldn't be treated as such, but I would just point out that in the 20th century, 200 million people were killed by their own governments. And we obsess over domestic, I don't mean in the sense of households, but domestic violence in America. And we really should. We shouldn't put up with it. We should try and work out what to do, although we're somewhat selective about what we care about. We care a huge amount about a shooting at a hospital or a school. We don't care very much about what happens over Memorial Day in any large American city.
That's right.
30, 40 people killed. Who cares, right? Where's our national conversation about that? But we should care about that. And we should care about the suicide rate. But, if we really want to look at what the big killer of free people has been for the last century, almost exactly the last century, actually, it has been governments, often governments that were supposed to take care of the people. And I think the idea that we should look at the 20th century and say, fine, let's give up our guns is crazy. And in fact, when people say there's no way James Madison could have anticipated the modern world, I think they're right, just not in the way they think. The tyranny of George III was rinky-dink. It was worth fighting against, but if you look at it, it was about good government. It was about the power of legislatures. It was about the right balance of authority between the national government or colonial government and communities. It was in some ways about gun control too. But compared to the tyrannies of the 20th century, compared to the Nazis and the Soviet Union and communist China, it was nothing. It was embarrassing. Frankly, compared to Jim Crow, what George III was doing was nothing. There was nothing compared to slavery either. And I think James Madison could not have imagined it. No, he could not have imagined the Wehrmacht, and he could not have imagined Lavrenti Beria. And because of that, we should be grateful that even though George III was a rinky-dink tyrant, he still helped build this country's order.
That's right. And I think there's an even more recent example, and it's not our own government, or in this case, the Ukrainian government. It was an invading force from another country that has, created terrible conditions. And it's funny because, and I remember talking to you at the time at the very start of the war, the New York Times printed a big piece about how they were distributing guns to private citizens in Ukraine, and they were all for it. They were lauding the effort to get weapons into the hands of private citizens in Ukraine. The irony of that is
well, someone said recently on Twitter that they would like to see a Venn diagram showing people with Ukrainian flags outside of their house and people who say no private citizen needs an assault weapon.
Yes, it's a very fair point. All right, here's a personal question for you from Charlotte. Would you have been less interested in becoming a U.S. citizen if there were no Second Amendment?
No. I always wanted to be an American ever since I was a little kid. I know that sounds odd. I don't know why, but no, I wouldn't have, because I wanted to be American when I was younger, and until I was maybe 20, I was strongly opposed to the private ownership of guns. And I thought it was a side of America I didn't really understand. So no, I've changed my mind on that one, though.
All right. This is a bit more of a technical question, but I think it's an important part of this debate. This is also from Leslie. Could you please discuss the definition of ghost guns versus 3D printed guns? Are they different? Secondly, is the production technology advanced enough to make them reliable for use? Third, we know that the legal basis to own these is the Second Amendment. What is the legal basis to ban them? And where do you see that debate going? I can repeat those if you can't remember.
No, I've got, so a ghost gun is a sort of generalized, vague term for a gun about which the federal government doesn't know. Now, most guns the federal government doesn't know about, at least in terms of their current whereabouts, and in some states their current owner. But these are guns that are created outside of the system completely. And this horrifies some people, including apparently President Biden. But actually, Americans have been able, without any impingement whatsoever, to build their own guns from the founding. They're still able to build their own guns. The only rule is if you build a gun in your home It has to be in compliance with state law, which isn't really a problem in Florida. And you're not allowed to transfer it to anyone. So I can't build my own gun for my own use without a serial number and then sell it or give it to someone else. So the reason ghost guns have come up, I think, is twofold. First, there have been some crimes committed with ghost guns, especially in Los Angeles. Gangs have started to use them. I personally don't understand why people worry about this, at least why they worry about it any more than gangs committing crimes with any other guns, given that gun registries have largely been abandoned because they don't do anything. I mean, not a single crime was ever solved by the Chicago gun registry. Not a single crime was ever solved by the DC gun registry. They don't do anything. So the problem with gangs is that they're gangs. It's not the lack of a serial number on the guns they're using. But there has been a very slight increase in that. And so that's freaked out certain people.
I think the fear is that, somebody could get angry and go home and print up a gun. And
right. Well, I was going to say the second part's the technological part. And I wonder whether, and this is a guess, but I wonder whether gun controllers have begun to recognize, much as, say, anti-pornography activists did in the 1990s, as the internet developed, that this is slipping away from them. I don't want to pick on him because I like him a great deal, but there is a clip of Chuck Grassley in the Senate in the late 1990s explaining all the ideas that he has to limit internet pornography. And if you know anything about the construction of the internet, as I do, it's farcical. And I have no issue with his caring about the issue, but he'd never make that speech now in 2022. He wouldn't dream of it. It would be so far-fetched as to be bizarre. And I wonder whether, given the quality of it's not just 3D printers. It's frankly, you can build an AR-15 with a handheld jig, but there are
what's a
printing
handheld jig?
a jig. So when you get a lower receiver for an AR-15, you can either get it finished, which will have a serial number on it, which is ready to go, or you can get what's called an 80% lower. And the 80% lower is a printed equivalent, but it doesn't have the holes in it, which the rest of the gun bolts into. And in order to put those holes in, the best way of doing it is with machinery. And there are machines that you can buy that will do, 30 of them an hour. You just put the unit in, it drills the hole. And that's, of course, what would happen at a manufacturer. But you can also buy a handheld jig and put the holes in yourself. It's almost like a corkscrew, but just more heavy duty. And it will work. So I think part of the issue here is that gun controllers have recognized we're losing control of this. I don't know what will happen in the future. Maybe we will see some horrific crime committed with a so-called ghost gun. But I do think it's worth reiterating that the sort of people who are willing to spend the time and effort and money and care building guns in their house are not killing people with them. And it is a laborious process. It is a process that requires reading. Even if you have a machine, you still have to know what you're doing. I mean, we're talking about ballistics here. We're talking about compressed tubes full of
that's a very good point.
Rifling that are triggered by the explosion of gunpowder. The idea that the sort of person we saw in Uvalde is going to be engaging in this process is silly.
Right. All right. Just a few minutes left here. So a couple of quick questions. One, this is another argument that comes up a lot. Why don't we just limit the sale of ammunition or make it super expensive?
Well, there's a constitutional reason and then there's a practical reason. The constitutional reason is that, as the Supreme Court has correctly noted over and over again, you can't do an end run around the Bill of Rights. You can't say, sure, Ricochet has the right to offer a service on which people can say whatever they want, but you get 1 megabyte of bandwidth every month. Or every gig of bandwidth is $25,000. That is a speech restriction. You can't say, sure, the New York Times can publish whatever it wants, but we're putting a tax on ink of $100,000 a barrel. And you can't do it with guns either. You can't charge people to use the jury system. You can't charge people for the right to due process. In fact, we've passed laws in most states, and there are Supreme Court decisions that mandate the provision of public defenders to make sure people can use the system. We where possible, like to make it possible for people to exercise their constitutional rights. And a massive tax on bullets or restriction on the number of bullets would be just another way of achieving gun control that is unconstitutional. And then the practical reason is that it's actually really not very difficult to make rounds. And a lot of people, especially
can you
people
3D print rounds?
No, but you can make them very easily with some fairly elementary equipment and a little bit of metal and some gunpowder. And a lot of people involved in shooting sports are reloaders, and what they will pick up the empty cases that, you see them at gun ranges. They go around and they take home, 1,000 empty cases, and then they will buy the part of the ammunition that is the bullet, and they will refill them with powder, and then they will use a machine that's a little like the machine you would cork a bottle of wine with to seal it. And anyone who wants to defend themselves, or frankly who wants to do harm, is not going to struggle to get hold of that ammunition.
People in the chat are telling me that right now ammo is limited and also expensive.
That's true, but yeah. not at least directly by the government.
Right. Exactly. All right. Here's another one that I've heard discussed a lot over the past few days. I believe the shooter in the Buffalo incident was wearing body armor, which made it much harder for the police to bring him down or stop him. And in fact, I believe the grocery store security guard fired at him, and it had no effect because he was wearing body armor. There's no mention of body armor in the Constitution. Why don't we ban the sale of body armor to civilians?
I'll be honest with you, I haven't thought a great deal about this issue. There's no question that body armor is protected by the Second Amendment because it's not arms, and in no definition is it arms. So the question is that a good idea? I mean, my reflexive answer is no, because I don't like government involvement in most areas. I think that people who genuinely believe, as I do, that concealed carriers make us safer and that concealed carriers are law-abiding, do need to think through the implications of an increase in the use of body armor by people who wish to do harm. Because the argument, well, what you need is a good guy with a gun, is true. The left sees that as an escalation. I see that as a recognition of where we are. If someone has body armor, that does change a bit. It was difficult in Buffalo, and it was difficult in Sutherland Springs in the shooting in the church in Texas as well. Although luckily, the guy who responded to that was an NRA instructor who recognized the body armor and knew where to shoot and was a good enough shot to take out the killer. I think it would be so premature and knee-jerk to say, right, we need to ban body armor. But I do think that gun rights advocates ought to think through the implications of an increase in its use. And I mean, that's something I intend to do because it has changed the equation a bit.
It would seem like it would be an easy give. Maybe too easy. I mean, I don't know. I don't know enough about the slippery slope arguments. And you
I'm not big on ill thought through easy gives. When we did the Ricochet podcast, Peter Robinson asked, I think from a devil's advocate perspective, a good question, which is, look, there's a lot of public pressure. What can we give them? I don't see fundamental rights like that. I'm not saying body armor is a fundamental right, but once governments take action, they're very reluctant to undo it. If you look at, say, the drinking age, that's 21 in every state because we passed in the 1980s a federal law that ties highway funds to it. I think it's a bad idea. I think it would make a lot more sense if the rest of the age of majority were raised to 21, as I said earlier. And if it were, I would take that as a trade-off. I think given that it's 18 in most cases, it is ridiculous. But that law is never going to go away because there's no great constituency for it. There aren't enough people who are willing to band together. Americans don't actually drink enough compared to the Brits for there to be enough people. Functionally 65% of Americans don't drink or have one beer a week. And no politician wants to be the guy who says, yes, let's lower this to 18, and then is shouted at by someone who lost their son or daughter in a car accident. And I think, we should reflexively take that view of all laws. Let's be very, very sure before we ban something, because if we were to say, fine, whatever, it's an easy gift, let's ban body armor, but it turned out to be a bad idea or a useless idea, the next time somebody used body armor for ill, the politician who voted for that's going to be on the hook.
Right, but you can't, it's a defensive thing. You can't use it for ill. You're not going to knock somebody over the head with body
Well, you can
armor.
use it for ill in the sense that even if every single person in America up until 3 years from now had used it to defend themselves because they ran a store in a dangerous town, the first guy who shoots up a movie theater wearing body armor is going to be the one we all focus on. I mean, we already see this with guns.
That's what happened in Buffalo.
But when we see, right, that's what I'm saying. I mean, we already see this with guns, so the range of estimated defensive gun uses every year is between 100,000 and 2 million. So let's just take the 100,000 number, which is the one all the gun control advocates throw out. That's their absolute number. That's the one they believe is true. Okay, I think it's higher than that. The range should be respected. But let's say it's the lowest possible number, 100,000. That is a hell of a lot of defensive gun uses. Right. When was the last time we really talked about them? When was the last time we had a national conversation? That lady in West Virginia who shot the guy with the rifle who shot into the graduation crowd a week ago. Did you hear about that?
No, I didn't do this.
No. So I think a lot of your members have heard about it. But why isn't that woman being invited to the White House? Why isn't she a hero? Where's her television contract? No one cares about it.
Because
and I'm not
she's
saying
Joe
we shouldn't
Manchin's
focus.
Constituent.
Yeah, well, I'm not saying we shouldn't care about what happens when it's a tragedy. We really should. But no one ever sees the good guy. And so with body armor, I don't know if it's an easy give because I don't know how many people out there might need it not to do horrible things that we soak up all the attention.
Fair enough. Charlie, thank you so much for doing this. It was really a pleasure and fun for me and educational. Again, not much of a gun person, not a gun person at all. So all this stuff is very educational and enlightening for me. And I very much appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who came for all the great questions. I should also point out that Charlie is now a colleague of ours. He's, he and his company Astrolux take care of our the technical side of running this place. And he's also recently joined our board. So he's going to be around a lot and accessible through the support at Ricochet.com, not a website, but that you can access him there. I would not ask gun questions there. You should only ask technical questions there. We'll reserve the gun questions for events like this. But he will be here and he will be part of this little endeavor. So again, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who came by. Appreciate it. All right. I think we're done.
Thank you.
Okay. Good night.